jotting down some quick notes. So if I stumble around, it's because I'm having trouble reading them. But so I first thought that the conversation needs to begin with GLAAD Alliance, which is now the LGBTQ plus or Alliance Q Alliance. So in 1977 at the General Assembly in Kansas City, there was a lot of contention. There was the United Church of Christ had started ordaining people early in the early 70s, and so there was some sense among the denominations that if they were going to act, they needed to cut things off. Now, the difference between us and the Methodists and the Lutherans and the, name it, Presbyterians, is that, as you all know, we have autonomous congregations. So what happens in a General Assembly would not have been binding, but they could tell that there was a lot of negative energy towards the LGBT community at that time. And a woman named Carol Blakely, she's since passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, got up and spoke before the assembly about her son and his experience with the church and being shunned and all that stuff. So it was a beginning of it was the spark. And so in the following General Assembly 2 years later in St. Louis was the first time that people gathered secretly in an aside away from the assembly, and they only used their first names. So some of you can imagine, you can remember back what it was like. So here they are, they're meeting anonymously under the fear, that some of them were ordained and could lose their jobs. Just
what year was that, Kerry?
1979 was the first meeting of GLAAD. So for the next 8 years, they decided to meet yearly, even if there wasn't a General Assembly. And it was mainly to provide sanctuary and a space for people that were LGBT disciples to talk to each other and share experiences. And it was mainly to encourage. There was nothing legislatively in our country nor within the church that GLAAD could act on, but it was providing sanctuary was the chief thing. So in 1987 was the first time that GLAAD Alliance had a pre-assembly event. So if you've ever been to General Assembly, there's several pre-assembly events for organizations within the church for them to do workshops and fellowship and things like that. So that meeting was held in a More Light Presbyterian church, which, if you're not aware, More Light is the Presbyterian, it's the moniker that would be the same for GLAAD for us. So they're open and affirming, they don't use open affirming, their open and affirming congregations are More Light congregations. So that was the first time that GLAAD met in a church building. In 1989, the General Assembly was here in Indianapolis, and GLAAD met at Central, and a pastor by the name of Van Knight, who was minister there, didn't even ask the board. He just took, well, at our church, the minister has the right to do building usage. It doesn't have to go before the board or anything like that. So, it was the first time that GLAAD met in a disciples church building. In 1989, so GLAAD was gay, lesbian, and affirming disciples, which fit from that time period. But what we realized, well, I wasn't part of it then, but what they realized was that by that time, the inclusion part of the community was also including the bisexual, and the transgender. So they even though the name didn't change, they made it part of the mission statement to advocate for bisexual and transgender people too. So that, I'll talk a little bit more work about the council. The council is the group of 10 or 12 people that oversee the business of the organization. So there's the alliance, which is the alliance of individual members and the alliance of churches that are open and affirming. And then the council are the people that gather to determine next steps and financial stuff and stuff like that. So there's some stuff that we're going to talk about a little bit later where the council was involved, not necessarily the whole organization, but the council primarily was involved. And so it was only 3 years ago that we changed the name from Glad Alliance, because we still not had added the bisexual transgendered. And as many of you know, some of the younger members of our community embrace the word queer, or so some of the rest of us find that term still a little offensive, but listening to them, they needed a part that expressed they may not be identifying as a young person as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, but they feel othered, or they have some, or additionally, they may have some type of sexual fluidity that they don't want defined. So we put the Q on LGBTQ, and then the plus to include anybody else that might come along, and still include our allies. And also, it was important for us at that time to start looking about how we could do intersectionality stuff. So the plus was then an invitation to other ethnic minority groups within the church to join with us and find ways that we might have in common to strengthen and support each other. So that's kind of a short history of well, we'll call Alliance Q for the rest of the meeting. So it's short and easy to say. I don't know how long some of you have been disciples, but we'll start with the Indiana region first. In reaction to the Kansas City thing in 1978, the disciples here in Indiana created a resolution that forbade the ordination of, well, this exact language was avowed practicing homosexuals. And that became a laughing point later, but because we were, some of us that were gay in these conversations were like, well, we don't know any other kind. You're either avowed or you're not. But I think what the church was trying to say, anybody that was out. So as long as you kept your mouth shut and towed the line, and you didn't disclose that you were gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, then the ordination policy would not be invoked. What happened was, in that interim was, let's see, where's my notes on that? What happened was in, let's see what the year was. Well, going back to the 1970s, these policies in the region came into play, because that's where the Commission on Ministry and Nurture and Certification occurs. So ordination was handled by the region. So the church couldn't, the general church couldn't act on ordination because it was not their venue or their right. So what happened in the 70s was almost all the regions except one or two adopted a policy against the ordination of LGBTQ people. And that brings us up to, let's try and find the year here.
Just so you all know, while Kerry looks for that, the NERT insert and those kind of things that he's saying, those are bodies that meet with potential clergy folks and discern whether or not they're approved for ordination or transfer of ordination, and so it's a process that a board of individuals walk a potential candidate through, and that is handled regionally as opposed to denominationally.
Well, I can't find my note, but at one point then, it was in the, I think it was 2009. Yeah. There was they had the general church was ahead of the regions on the ordination issue. So what they did was they created a resolution that created a complication. And so the important words in the resolution was that God calls all persons to receive the good news of the gospel and accept their call to be God's people. The ministry of Christ is entrusted to all the people, and they are called to servant ministry lived out through covenant community. So what you had was the general church saying one thing in kind of vague language, but the regions having codified the opposite. So the general church kind of well, I think it was probably intentional, but without openly declaring it, was creating a path for the regions to start having conversations. So what happened was in 2010 then, after we became open affirming in 2008, and the elders kind of led that conversation in 2010, what may have been 2009, we had a conversation among the elders about, and we polled the congregants, and what they wanted us to do was take on the ordination issue. So we knew that as a single congregation, we couldn't do that. So we asked the regional minister, who is the same one we have now, and two people from the Commission on Ministry to come speak to us and say, what's the next path forward? Well, they were relieved in a way that a church was taking this out from under something they couldn't technically initiate themselves without backlash. So they said, and this is, well, it's okay to say it now. At the time, I probably wouldn't have repeated this. They said, if you will be the front people for this, we'll back you every way we can. So what Central did then was call a group of like people and like churches that we thought we could get together with and have some idea about what the next steps would be. So we got together and we met, I think once in Indianapolis, and then we had Southside from South Bend coming down, and that was a big trip for them. So we moved the meetings to Kokomo for 2 years after that. We met about monthly for 2 years, and we called ourselves unofficially the Kokomo Group. And included, I'm not sure I've got every church, the Elkhart Church, the South Bend Church, Terre Haute Central, Central Christian. There may have been one or two others. And it's probably all in all about 12 to 15 people. So we began writing a resolution. We didn't know which regional assembly we were going to introduce it to, but we started on the conversations. And so we also didn't want to appear to be this small group that was meeting in secret. We were open to anybody that wanted to attend, but we didn't want to appear that this was coming from a very small group of people in secret, and all of a sudden it was going to get sprung. So we started becoming intentional about inviting other churches and to be more transparent. So what happened was in 2010 at the regional assembly, we got up and made a report about what the group had been doing. So there was full transparency. There didn't seem to be major pushback. There was a little bit in the conversations, but because it was just a report, nobody wanted to fight over it. So, and I also got to keep in mind that I forgot to mention this. In the year 2000, 2001 probably, no, 2000, the regional assembly in Richmond, Indiana was where the ordination issue was brought up, because a young man at Central, I didn't even know he was gay, but he came out right, like within a month of him being ordained. He'd gone through the full tract at CTS and everything. And he challenged the policy. Well, that ended up not working out so well. I think it was because it was so sudden and there wasn't conversations ahead of time, and it was a short time before his ordination. So under the rules, they couldn't approve him for ordination. He has since left the disciples and gone to the Episcopalian Church, which he seems to be thriving in. So in 2012, then, after meeting for 2 years, we had this resolution ready. And it's strange how when you're trying to do the right thing, but it's even in a church environment, you almost have to become political. So we sent a letter out to all the churches saying this was the draft, it wasn't the final copy. If people had stuff, well, what happened was we had 2 churches in the state then that started instigating the other side of the conversation. And they were actually threatened. We knew this would happen. They were actually threatening to leave the region or the denomination over this. And so what happened was we invited them to come to Kokomo, and 2 other churches did, not those 2 churches, but 2 other churches did. And it was kind of hard to sit across the table from somebody that they were sincere and they weren't mean about it, but would look at me or somebody else that was LGBT at the table and say, well, we welcome all to the communion table, but in the same way we welcome an alcoholic. And so it required a lot of tongue biting and saying nothing when the words were hurtful, but to further the process. Well, in 2012, on September 29th at the Regional Assembly, we had strategized for all the what could happen. And the resolution was put forward and was voted on, and it was 336 yes and no 144. It passed by a much larger margin among the delegates than we thought it was going to. And actually, we were prepared for people that would go to if you've ever been to an assembly, either regional or general, there's a yes and a no microphone. Nobody went to the no microphone at all. So that was a huge victory.
Hey, Kerry, I have a quick question.
Sure.
The churches that you said were actively opposing the resolution, were they actively recruiting other churches as well?
Yeah. Yes.
In an effort.
Their letter was an attempt to do, yes. So.
Did it work?
No. It appeared that it might at first, and that was a sincere fear that, well, what if 20 or 30 or 50 congregations leave the region, But it never happened. We might have had 1 or 2 after the resolution was voted on, but reports we got from the region, I won't name any names, said that they weren't contributing to the region or the life of the church anyway. They were small congregations. It's like, if that was the only price we had to pay, you don't want to see anybody leave, but if that was the price we had to pay to accomplish that, then it was controlled damage, so to speak.
It was still the right thing to do. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we get to the general church. I was vice moderator of the council, the National Council, when we did this, and we had talked about at the Regional Assembly in 2011 in Nashville about doing this. So the work of the council then, when we met, we moved from meeting every month to meeting every 2 weeks for 2 years so that we could hammer out this resolution that we were going to put before the assembly in Orlando. And the title of the resolution was, it wasn't our title, the church changed it, which, in these kind of things, you make certain concessions, and the title of it was not something that we needed to fall on our sword over. So the church, I don't remember what we originally called it, but the church changed it to, it was Resolution 1327 in July of 2013, becoming a people of grace and welcome to all. But if you go online and look at it, it's very specific about what the resolution was about. So I remember one discussion we had where we were trying to formulate some of the whereases, and one of the council members said, well, we need the church to say this is not a sin. I said, yeah, that's what we want them to say, but we don't want to provide an opportunity for debate and start another conversation that sidetracks what we're trying to do. Let's make them be disciples and say something they already believe in, but they're not practicing. So we changed the final whereas is that the church would recognize the faith, baptism, and spiritual gifts of all Christians, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and that neither is grounds for exclusion from fellowship or service within the church, but we celebrate that all part of God's, we celebrate all that's part of God's good creation. So we turned the thing from a negative to a positive. There was no way they were going to say they couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And if they weren't going to be good disciples. The thing passed overwhelmingly in Orlando. The last thing they did, and I wasn't on the council then, was General Assembly Resolution 1929, which was last year in Des Moines. And the title of that resolution was An Invitation to Education for Welcoming and Receiving the Gifts of Transgender and Gender Diverse People. And you can go online and look at that too. It's pretty well spelled out. So that's a short history of what's going on in the church. What we didn't know the ramifications of it. We expected that the resolution in Orlando 1327 would create an openness within the general church around people's jobs and employment and domestic partnership and stuff like that. And it did. We didn't know what would happen in the local churches, because as most of you know, any General Assembly resolution is a sense of the assembly. It's a sense of the people that come together for that particular time and space. And it's non-binding on local churches. So we didn't know how it would play out at the local level. Well, what happened was we had seen, up until that time, we'd seen a steady pace in open and affirming churches, maybe one every month or one every 6 weeks or sometimes two in a month. And what happened after that resolution was we saw churches going through the process of becoming open and affirming skyrocketing. And what we didn't really take into account was that resolution, beyond and above what the church did, was it gave all these churches permission to have those conversations. Yeah. And so in hindsight, I don't know denominationally if we lost any churches we might have, but it's a whole different church than it was even 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's what, as you were talking, I was kind of taken aback by the dates, honestly, and that,
Yeah, United Church of Christ, our ecumenical partners are like 30 years ahead of us.
Yeah, it's a bit surprising. And Downey, which is a pretty progressive, open, we're an open and affirming community, but didn't become so until like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And which is shocking to me that that was just right before Trey got there. They decided to actually take a vote and become open and affirming. I think they had held themselves up as that for a long time, but didn't actually do the work to become officially open and affirming until like 2015, something like that.
Well, I think that's not out of the norm, because when we get reports from our churches as they're going through the process, well, I know at Central, let's say, I started attending there in 1994. The question was raised. For the first couple of years, I didn't shake the boat very much, but by the year 2000, when the ordination issue had been forced by the young man in Richmond, Central, we'd had conversations before that. And because this happened within our own congregation, it kind of blew up the conversation. But even then, from 2000 to 2000, and we went through the discernment process that was provided by the church in 2000 and 2001. And the region encouraged all the churches in Indiana to do it, and only about 13 did. It still took Central 8 years.
Yeah, wow.
And they did the same questions that every church does. Well, if we do this, will we become a gay church? You know, it's all that stuff that they get in their heads, and they thought it was going to change everything. And it did change things. What happened was we started getting young couples with children who wanted to raise their kids in a diverse community. And what we get is what we were slowly getting is not LGBTQ necessarily. It was everybody that ever felt othered in some other way. And so it does have, you guys have probably experienced the same thing.
Yeah, it's hands down, when new people come to the church, the number one thing that they tell us that brought them to the church is that we're open and affirming. There are lots of other things, but that very ideal that the church has adopted as part of our vision and mission is the number one thing that brings people in. Yeah. Hands down, not even a question of other things. Like, and those things, other things matter for sure, but that is the thing that makes people go, okay, I'm going to check this out.
Believe it or not, that's still a conversation that plays out in churches that haven't gone through the process. It's like the Central said this, and probably Downey Avenue did too, or maybe a few people did. It's like, well, we're already that. Why do we have to say it? Why do we have to codify it? Why do we have, which is a really good disciple argument if you think about it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, yeah. And when I hear somebody like in an assembly or something like that say that, it's like, you don't realize how this will change your church if you do this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I was encouraged that at General Assembly in Iowa last year, the Alliance Q group was overwhelmingly popular, in the sense of there's all sorts of, if you've never been to a general, Kate, have you been to a General Assembly? So Toma, have you been to it? Okay. So at the General Assembly, there's different groups, different ministries within the Disciples Church that host like dinners and programs for people to pay money and go to and participate in. And the one that sold out was the Alliance Q dinner. Sold out first. And they were, the transgender resolution was overwhelmingly supported, and I saw young queer people all over the assembly floor and being engaged in worship. And so it was actually quite exciting to see all of the amazing ways that the Alliance had made leaps and bounds in their ministry and creating avenues of openness for people. Now, I'm sure it's true, I've been told that it's true that the folks who go to General Assembly are not necessarily 100% indicative of the people in the pew who don't go to General Assembly, and I'm sure that's true. But still, to have the folks who are leading the denomination, because that's typically what General Assembly is, people who are invested in their communities, were really on board with full LGBT inclusion, and so that was really exciting. And we had a member at our church, he passed away last year, Bob Glover, who was really instrumental in helping Downey become open and affirming. It was his mission to bring Downey along, and he did. And he always, even in the 1960s and 1970s, when he worked for the denomination, he hired LGBTQ people. He made sure that LGBTQ people were included and was vocal about the inclusion of LGBT folks long before many others did. So that's a rich history that we have through Bob. Yeah. What questions, Kate, Toma, do you have for Kerry?
I don't know. I don't know. I was just interested in hearing the history. Because, like you said, that's the number one thing that brought me to the church, completely. And I just wanted to. I was just tired of the same old rhetoric from other churches and listening, and I just really searched for that. And so I'm not sure what other questions I might have. It was interesting, really interesting.
I know just about a year ago, something interesting happened at Downey. It was a Sunday evening and we were having youth group, and a parent was dropping off their 2 kids coming to youth group, and she was kind of walking up the sidewalk with them. And I was inside the building on the other side of the glass door, and I watched as a car pulled up on the street and, you know, kind of shouted something at her, and she kind of turned around and took a couple steps toward the car and was talking to them. And then after, you know, just a few seconds, it wasn't long, she turned around to come back in, to continue coming toward the building, and the car drove away. And she said, "You are not going to believe what he just said." That some stranger who did not know her pulled over and said, "Why are you going in that church? Don't you know they love gays there?" And she said, "Yeah, that's why I go to this church." And the person said, "Well, I used to be a member there, but they forced gays down our throats and became, you know, they became a gay-loving church, and that's, you know, an abomination to God." And she was like, "Well, I love the gays and I love the church, and I'm super glad to be a part of the gay church." So, and then, you know, he was like, "Well, you know, I don't know what he said." And then he drove off, and she came in and she was like, "Man, it was like 2019. She's like, 2019. And still people feel compelled to pull over and say, "Don't you know they love gays there?" As if you shouldn't be going to that church for that reason. So
I can tell you a conversation that kind of was the opposite of that. When we were getting the Res 1327 to go before the church in 2013, Sharon Watkins was general minister and president. So and because there was some pushback from some of the ethnic parts of the church, she asked if 3 members of each organization, so it was NAPAD, GLAD, Obra Hispana, Convocation, and then 3 people from the general church. And we met in Avon at a hotel conference room, and it was to try and work out pre-assembly the issues. And I remember the most anti-gay person was part of Obra. The other 2 people weren't saying a whole lot. And he was just so upset that this was going to become before the church for even consideration. And Mark Johnston, he just quit being executive director of Open Affirming Ministries, but he moved with his partner to Germany just about 2 weeks ago. But Mark was one, and then Karen Barr and myself. Karen was the moderator, I was the vice moderator. And I remember, you know, if you've ever been in a room where it's so tense, you could almost cut the tenseness with a knife. Mark looked at, his name was Jose, looked at Jose and said, "Jose, look at me, look at Mark and say, Mark, you are not a child of God." And Jose didn't want to do it. And Mark said, "Jose, I'm going to ask you a second time. Say Mark is not a child of God." And he got mad, and Mark said a third time, and Jose blew up. So, you know, the problem with us being disciples is that our own theology works against us in these issues. So he couldn't claim that, although that's what he wanted to imply by not pushing the resolution forward. But he could not look at Mark and say that. And, you know, and then some of the other private conversations in Orlando that people came up to the booth that they weren't necessarily for or against it, but they were sitting in the middle and they said, "Well, why is this necessary?" And I said, because, or we were saying, this was our messaging, was because disciple theology has always said that all are welcome at the table. We don't exclude anybody from taking communion. It's the central part of our worship. If we only came together for one thing, that would be the thing we do. Mm-hmm. And we've always said all are welcome at the table. So why is this resolution an issue? And you know, when you put it like that, when you challenge disciples on their own theology and take them out of their prejudices, you win the day, usually. So.
And history has proven that that's true, right? The resolution
Yeah.
passed, and
yeah,
and here I am as a result of it, actually.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Now, you mentioned earlier, Kerry, can you just make the distinction between the council and the Alliance Q and how those work together?
Okay, the Alliance Q, for the short, it's the short moniker for LGBTQ plus Alliance, or the old GLAD. That is officially all the people that pay individual dues or individual members, and all the individual ONA churches. So that's the Alliance. Plus our straight allies, but they fall under the membership thing anyway. So the council is we just can't have a free-for-all in writing a resolution. So you kind of have to have the 10 or 12 people on the council. And we got input from all over, but we couldn't just invite 50 voices to the table because it would just been confusion. It was the council's job is to pay our few bills, do policy and legal for the organization. Just much like a church board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who took Mark's place?
I forget her name. She came, we had a Zoom meeting of the Indiana Alliance, and I think her name's Melissa. I think her last name begins with a G. She's a lesbian in a committed relationship with her partner. We hired as executive director about 8 or 9 months ago. She's doing a fantastic job.
Okay.
And so, yeah, she took Mark's place. But we kind of moved her over as executive director of all of it, where Mark was just kind of, she still answers to the council if there's a question or something, but she has free reign otherwise. So instead of just being head of Open Affirming Ministry, she's over it all now.
Oh.
She's the spokesperson for anything LGBTQ disciple.
Okay. And you're still on the council?
No, I finished, actually Orlando was when I went off. So I was on it for 4 years. I came on in Indianapolis in, 2009 and went off in 2013.
Okay. Right. Do you still make the Indiana virtual Alliance meetings?
I didn't make the very last meeting. I did the one before that. Melissa was on for that. And she wanted to know all about what was going on with Indiana churches, and she wanted to know what was going on in the city. We told her about IYG and how early IYG was one of the few youth groups in the country. It's not so much that way now. There's more now, but she was really impressed, because she didn't say this, but, I think usually people that are outside of Indiana, because we're a red state, are impressed that anything's going on at all, but she was really impressed.
Good. Well, the Alliance is, anybody can join the Alliance, pay membership dues, and then can support the LGBT inclusion work that the Alliance does throughout the denomination. And then they're virtual meetings, and I think they typically are anyway, right, to include everybody around the city.
Well, they'll probably go to Zoom now. When I was on it, we were doing it by telephone, so we'd all be on a conference call.
Yeah.
No visuals.
Yeah. So that group meets monthly, and folks are invited to become members of that. And then at General Assembly, there's a members conversations to be had around the updates on the LGBT work that the Alliance is doing, and a dinner, and it's
their pre-assembly events are pretty fun. If you go to General Assembly, of course it adds on another night of hotel bills, which is kind of daunting when you're there for 4 days anyway, if you stay for the whole thing. But the pre-assembly events, really nice to be with other queer people and talk about, usually we have speakers around. We've done a lot of transgender work, but I think well, for me, the big benefit has always been sharing best practices within our congregations and how to have conversations with people that don't agree with us. And it's a good thing if you get the opportunity to partake of.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kerry, for sharing that information and enlightening us a little bit and letting us know a little bit of the history there. And I'm particularly grateful that you shared some Indiana history and letting us know about our region. And there are some regions still in our denomination that have not adopted open and affirming positions in the region.
It was a mixed bag. When we started surveying the regions, it was hard to get information, but we partnered with the Upper Midwest, who had gone through it right before we did. So we had a lot of conversation, teleconference calls with their regional minister saying, you know, how did you handle this? How did you take it to the assembly and the Upper Midwest? And, you know, trying to get good information on what their experiences had been. And it's our polity makes it really interesting. You know, so the Methodists meet and they do. The problem is they can't do anything because they're a worldwide fellowship, where we are just United States and Canada. So our partners in the Congo do their own thing and don't affect our votes. So, and then we're further blessed in the fact that we're autonomous congregations. So we don't have to convince a whole denomination necessarily that this is the right thing to do. So we have disciple churches that are open and affirming. We have disciple churches that have LGBT people in office and ministry, and you know, it's just it just varies. You know, you could go to a disciple church in Southern Indiana, and you probably have to stay in the closet just to be there.
You probably have to stay in the car just to make sure.
Yeah, that's true. But it's the difference in our congregations.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions or comments for Kerry?
No, Kerry, thank you. It was really interesting.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thrilled to have you. And I have recorded our conversations, and so I know typically we've been getting about 20-25 views for these videos, so I'm sure that we'll have a few other folks who watch the video to learn a little bit about the history, inclusion and history in the denomination and region. So thanks again, Kerry. Good to see you.
No problem.
I hope you have a great night.
All right. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.